what a pleasure to be in beautiful, cool Asheville, where there's never any humidity. It's nice to be up in the mountains. Actually, it really is nice to be here, especially in this incredibly beautiful bookstore. I always forget between visits what a beautiful bookstore this is. And I got to say, it's sort of, we're all kind of crawling back out from under our respective rocks now. And it's very good to see things that have survived the last couple of years intact and in good shape, like this bookstore.
A little closer. I apologize,
there you go.
everybody.
But it is worth remembering, since I've done a lot of writing over the years on local economies, that that communities that took their local bookstore for granted no longer have one. So keep supporting it. And I had an interesting day. I spent much of it over at the university at the New Ideas Festival that they're sponsoring, and it was actually great fun. Mostly talking about this work we're now doing with Third Act, which I will get to before we're done. And in a way, it grew out of this book, which is as close to a memoir as I'm ever likely to write, which is not very close, I must say. But I'd always, it never occurred to me to write anything like a memoir, mostly because my life had been extremely average in every way. And I can almost, well, maybe I'll just read the very beginning just to prove that to you. In my 10th year in 1970, my family, my mom, my dad, my 7-year-old brother, and I moved into the American suburbs. More precisely, we moved to the town of Lexington, Massachusetts, a community of 30,000 people, which sat a dozen miles outside Boston. Our home, which cost $30,000, was like a child's drawing of a suburban home. A square block with a door and a window on the ground floor, and 2 windows on the story above, one looking out from my bedroom and the other from Tom's. A single big maple spread its branches over the front lawn and the driveway, dropping leaves on the maroon Plymouth that carried my father on his daily commute. We were as statistically average as it was possible to be, a near perfect example of the white American middle class then in the process of rocketing to a prosperity, a widespread shared suburban standard of living that the world had never before seen. We lived, and this is the truth, halfway down a leafy road called Middle Street. It really was about as middle American as you could get, especially since Lexington was as iconic an American location as it was possible to imagine. And indeed, my summer job for years was giving tours on the battle green, wearing my tricorn hat. And my scout troop raised the flag over the battle green on the morning of the bicentennial, and which is to say that I came by my patriotism honestly, and that was actually very formative for me in a lot of ways, because telling the story over and over again of the Battle of Lexington meant that I never confused, never thought there was any contradiction between patriotism and dissent. Sort of telling the story of the first battle against colonialism and imperialism was sort of proof against that. But we've learned a lot over the last half century about the world. And so this book in some ways is a re-examination of that suburban American idol, trying to figure out how exactly we went from that vision of a kind of shared, if modest prosperity, expanding to more and more and more people in a country that seemed to be, though convulsed in certain ways by assassinations and war, nonetheless to be getting its act together. The Voting Rights Act had just passed, expanding the franchise. We were suddenly taking women seriously as full members of society. 1970 marked the first Earth Day, and 20 million Americans out in the streets, and that worked the way it was supposed to work. Within a year or two, we passed the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. And what do you know? The air was getting cleaner, and so was the water. how we got from that to the country we live in now, where that shared prosperity turned out to be headed for a kind of almost unbelievably cartoonish inequality, where we're watching things like the rights of women begin to be eroded and the franchise that had been extended to more people pulled back as we suppress votes, not to mention living on a planet where the ice caps are melting and we face existential danger in a way we never have before. Where did things go wrong? And I really came to believe that early, that decade of the 1970s was quite interesting to think about, because it was sort of the hinge decade between, say, the first Earth Day at one end and the election of Ronald Reagan at the other, which I think is the kind of pivot point of American history. The moment at which we decide that we don't any longer want the kind of shared common sense of community that in certain ways had brought us through the Depression and the war and kind of the decades immediately following it. And instead we were ready for the kind of radical hyper-individualism represented by Reagan. So I'll get to that in a moment. But thinking about it, among other things, made one go back and think about all the things that we took for granted, including things about American history, even the most noble stories. So one of the things that I was doing was going back and looking again at that history that I've been telling when I was a boy, giving tours on the Queen. I went back and reread Paul Revere's account of his ride out to Lexington, as iconic an American moment as there was, because Longfellow took his account and immortalized it forever. But reading it, I was struck by one passage, and I'll read it for you here. Revere's describing his ride. He said, "I set off on a very good horse. It was then about 11 o'clock and very pleasant. After I had passed Charlestown Neck and got nearly opposite where Mark was hung in chains, I saw two men on horseback under a tree, British officers." Well, the part that I never noticed was the part where we just referred offhand to where Mark hung in chains. And it took a lot of research to figure out what on earth this was about, because no one else had apparently much noticed it either. But it turns out that 20 years before the Revolution, a man in Massachusetts named Mark Codman, who was a slave, had a particularly cruel master and had murdered him. And instead of charging him with murder, they charged him with high treason. And then after he'd been drawn and quartered, they put his body in an iron cage called a gibbet and hung it from the tree above the common, where it stayed for at least 40 years. Pretty soon all the flesh had rotted off, and you're just left with the bones, and there they hung as a reminder that nobody else in a similar position should try this again. Well, once you've read that, know that, it puts those stories about the Minutemen, about Paul Revere and the Sons of Liberty and so on, in a slightly different, puts a slightly different valence on it all, and makes you go back and ask some deep questions. And there's a lot of questions about race here, especially about how it played out in suburban America, and what a force for inequality, housing segregation became over the last decades. I won't read from the middle section about the cross, about Christianity, but suffice it to say that in 1970, when that decade began, there was a kind of shared, again, consensus notion on what we were supposed to do on Sunday morning. More than 50% of Americans belong to one of the mainline Protestant denominations: Methodists, Lutherans, Congregationalists, Episcopalians, Presbyterians. More than half, and another 35% or so of the country were Roman Catholic. So that was the most dominant possible part of who we were. And nothing has changed as fast and as quickly in America, except perhaps the effects of the rise of the internet. The rapid decline from that 50% to under 15% now in those denominations. And if you're like me and still a Methodist and go to church, you'll know that everybody left is my age or older. So, and instead of that consensus religious experience, which had plenty of flaws, but was nonetheless part of this, what I've been describing as this kind of model of some sort of solidarity and community. We replaced it, to the extent we replaced it with anything, with the kind of evangelicalism that was very deeply about an individual relationship with your Lord and personal Savior and all that that meant, and a politics not of shared responsibility for anything, but a politics that holds people highly accountable for whether they ended up poor or whatever it is. Very much in that same mode, and obviously part of that transition that happened as we went into this new world. A transition, by the way, the Reagan years, that lasts to this day. Barack Obama, in a really fascinating interview last year, was asked, about why his ambitions had been so limited in certain ways during his presidency, even though he had, unlike Joe Biden, he had 60 Democratic senators. And he said, we were still operating under what we thought the rules were that Ronald Reagan had set. That there were distinct limits as to how far we could go, that markets were still supposed to solve all problems, so on and so forth. That was a very powerful thing that happened. And of course, in some ways, the most powerful part of it was what it did to the world around us, to the environment. The third part of this book is called The Station Wagon. Here I will read a little bit. Almost everybody here is of an age to remember what a station wagon was. Younger people, I sometimes have to remind them that before we all acquired semi-military vehicles in which to move our stuff, we had what seemed at the time quite large cars. We actually didn't have one. We were a sedan family, but everyone else did. Driveway after driveway filled with country squires, Pontiac Safaris, Buick estate wagons. The Silvermans, for instance, with whom we shared a double driveway, and who on a warm summer evening would pile all the kids in the back and all the adults in front. We'd drive off 2 or 3 miles to the ice cream stand, which happened to be on the spot where a British patrol managed to detain Paul Revere later in his ride. When I say the kids piled in the back, I mean we crammed in the back cargo area. And if memory serves correctly, on the back roads, Mr. Silverman would actually lower the tailgate and let us dangle our legs over the back. Needless to say, all of this would now get you arrested for child endangerment, but we loved it without even thinking about it, because the car was the absolute unquestioned reality of our lives. Of course, Americans have been buying cars in some numbers since the teens, Henry Ford's assembly line. But really, it wasn't, it turns out, until after World War II that it really took off. There were about 25 million cars on the road at the end of the war, but the next year they produced 8 million new ones. And by the end of the decade, there were about 67 million cars on the road by 1960. And those roads, of course, stretched everywhere, since the 1950s also saw the construction of the interstate highway system, the largest public works program in American history. I'd never left the continent till well past college, but I'd seen an awful lot of the US. Vacation meant piling in the car and driving, covering ground along the route that someone in the AAA office had highlighted in our travel guide. And until about 5 in the afternoon, when it was time to search for a motel, my brother and I would commandeer the travel guide. The first week, it'd have to be a swimming pool at the motel we were going to. But and other people maybe can check me on this because it seems too fantastic now to believe, but the other thing that we really wanted to find was a hotel with a technology called Magic Fingers, where if you put a quarter in, the bed would begin to shake. Somehow now it seems entirely unlikely that this was considered as, I mean, remarkable a thing as we thought it was then. But we loved it. It took no time, a decade, for America to construct itself around the car. That's what the suburb was, a reflection in concrete and wood and brick of the logic of the automobile, designed right down for its turning radius. The further out you went, the more car-centric the suburbs became, until they were just a series of branching roads that eventually turned into driveways. More than 3/4 of Americans drove to work, almost all of them by themselves. By 1970, Americans consumed a third of the world's energy, about 3% of the world's population, more than the Soviet Union, Britain, West Germany, and Japan combined, and mostly because of the car. By 1970, there were 118 million cars and trucks on the American road. And the cars were big, 20% bigger than they'd just been 5 years before. 3/4 of them now came with air conditioning, up from 20% in 1960, which subtracted 2.5 miles a gallon from the fuel efficiency. Not that that was a thing anyone even thought about in 1970, because gas was 36 cents a gallon. So I got my learner's permit the day I turned 15 and a half. And of course, I sat through driver's ed with its interminable film strips about kids who took a bewildering variety of drugs and subsequently crashed their vehicles. We practiced on a driving simulator and then on a road with a baseball coach supplementing his pay. He directed me to merge onto the highway at 70 miles per hour 4 minutes into my driving career. I loved it, and not just because cars meant sex. We literally called it parking, because it meant economic freedom. You could work in order to get money to buy gas. But my work by then was for the local chain of suburban weekly newspapers, where I started writing when I was 14 or 15. And the story that I was covering more than any other was the sudden violent collision between that car culture and world geopolitics. These were the years of the oil shocks in the 1970s. By 1978, the second time, my job was just making endless rounds of calls to local filling stations to see when they'd be open and for how long, so we could print the schedules on the front page, because almost everybody was out of gas almost all the time. Along with the gas station owners, I've also got to interview the number 3 man in the country's energy department. John Deutsch was an MIT professor, and in between Washington stints, he lived in Lexington. So I talked with him the week before his boss, President Carter, was to give a nationwide address on energy conservation. Deutsch was sounding appropriately sober. If you're a person in a situation where there's too little oil, you would look for easy solutions and for scapegoats, he said. But there is no quick fix. There is no question about the fact that till the American people understand there's not as much oil as they want at prices they want, there will be problems. Carter had been striking the same note all along. And listen to the way that Carter talks, and then try to imagine anyone saying anything like this at the moment. And it sort of gives you a gauge on the kind of political maturity of our society. His first address as president, he'd said, "We have learned that more is not necessarily better, that even our great nation has its recognized limits. The energy crisis was a reminder that ours is the most wasteful nation on earth. As the gas lines grew longer, his sobriety deepened. All the legislation in the world can't fix what is wrong with America," he said. "Too many of us now tend to worship self-indulgence and consumption. We should change," he said. "We should learn that owning things and consuming things does not satisfy our longing for meaning. That piling up material goods cannot fill the emptiness of lives which have no confidence or purpose." If that sounded like an attack on suburbia, well, it kind of was, or if not an attack, then an invitation to think a little differently, and an invitation that might actually have been answered. The 1970s, we forget that Carter very nearly won his election in 1980. He was ahead of Reagan 2 weeks to go. The 1970s has begun with the publication of a book called The Limits to Growth, an argument that we were reaching ecological boundaries, which became one of the best-selling nonfiction volumes ever. The 50th anniversary edition is out in a few weeks, I think. A few years later, E.F. Schumacher had produced Small is Beautiful, a book so powerful that when its author came to America, Carter hosted him at the White House. Carter's senior policy advisor brought the president in 1980 polling data to show him how up in the air America really was. The data showed that 30% of Americans were pro-growth, 31% were anti-growth, and 39% were highly uncertain. That kind of ambivalence, the pollster told the president, was too stressful for societies to endure. And he was right, which explains, I think, that fateful 1980 election and much that's happened since. That choice, among other things, had profound implications for energy. Running for president in 1980, Carter had laid out a plan and budgeted for a plan that would have had 20% of the US electricity supply coming from solar power by the year 2000. And there's no reason that we couldn't have done it. There's not been some technological breakthrough in the years since that wouldn't have happened or so on. If we'd set our mind to doing it, we would have gotten those breakthroughs decades earlier. And we would be in an entirely different place to deal with climate change. He made that announcement at the moment that he put solar panels on the roof of the White House, made the announcement to the top of the White House. Well, of course, Ronald Reagan not only didn't fund solar energy, he very quickly ripped down those solar panels from the White House. And it's funny, I found them almost 30 some years later in a tiny college in rural Maine, a little place called Unity College. A professor had saved them and taken them up, and they were in a room up there. They lent them to me and several students, and we took a road trip down to Washington doing rallies along the way. These solar panels still worked fine as we kept demonstrating, and we wanted to give them back to Barack Obama to put this on the roof, but he was having none of it. And the reason in retrospect was clear. He didn't want to be associated in any way with the kind of legacy of Carter, which still seemed like failure and things, but now seems like extraordinary prescience, and Carter's willingness to make a sort of bet on the character of the American people turned out to be a bad bet, but a mark of a good soul and one from which we can still learn. So here we are in a very difficult place now with our backs very much against the wall. And we need very much to change and to move quickly. And I mean, we talk on a day when more than half of the American population is living under an extreme heat warning. Asheville's comparatively cool by comparison to almost every place else. The two biggest forest fires in the history of New Mexico are both raging. You saw the pictures perhaps from yesterday of what happens with the biggest rainstorm in history in that part of Montana. These are precisely the kind of things that happen around the world every day. And of course, when they happen other places, they're far worse than when they happen here because people aren't rich enough to come out from under them. Somalia right now, there was a great, if difficult to read story in the Times on the weekend, suffering through its fourth year with essentially no rain, and there's millions of people starving and hundreds of thousands of babies who will die in the next little while. And the pictures look like those pictures, and maybe people old enough in this room like me to remember when the Biafra crisis, and those were just babies with swollen bellies. That stuff had gotten a lot better over the last 30 years until about 5 years ago when it began to reverse. Because you just can't carry out civilizations like the ones we have in a world that's increasingly whipsawed by flood, by drought, by extreme heat that makes it impossible for people even to go outdoors and work. So we need very much to change. Obviously, that's what I've spent much of my life trying to figure out how to do. For me, the most interesting question in this book, in a way, at the end became who should be responsible for trying to make this change happen? So far, the answer to that has mostly been young people. I started 350.org with 7 college students, and that was great. They did an amazing job. We've organized 20,000 demonstrations in every country on earth except North Korea, and we kind of helped start the fight over the Keystone Pipeline that turned into the first big loss for big oil. And we launched this fossil fuel divestment campaign that's become now at $40 trillion in endowments and portfolios that have divested from fossil fuel. It's been successful and helpful. And more and more kids keep coming along to help. The kids who did those divestment campaigns in college, when they graduated, wanted to keep going, so they formed the Sunrise Movement and brought us the Green New Deal, which in its miniaturized form is the Build Back Better bill, now being waylaid by Joe Manchin and the oil industry. But it's as close as we've gotten yet, so good on those kids for making that happen. And of course, all about the beautiful stories of the high school and junior high school students all over the world. Greta Thunberg, and you should. She's one of my favorite people in the whole world. There's no one I like working with better. She's just great. But she'd be the first to say there are 10,000 Gretas around the world, and they have 10 million followers. That's how many kids left school in September of 2019 to go have these days of action in the streets. The real crest of the whole climate movement right before the pandemic cut that kind of thing off the knees. So kids are doing their part. In fact, doing it well enough that I began to worry at some point that people were succumbing to a temptation to just take the most difficult problem the world had ever faced and assign it to 17-year-olds to solve. Like in between algebra homework and field hockey practice, could you also save the world? And that's ignoble, but it's also impractical. They very much need the backup of the rest of us, and they very much deserve it. If you're 60 years old, 80% of the world's fossil fuel emissions have occurred in your lifetime. For 3/4 of your adult life, you've known about the dangers of the climate crisis, but for most people, it hasn't been changed much of it all in their lifestyle. But now, if we're to hold the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius, as the world promised in the Paris Climate Accords, the global lifetime carbon budget for someone born today would be 43 tons of CO2, about 1/8 as much as for someone born in 1950. And even if they do the hard work to meet that target, they'll still get to live their lives on a planet without an Arctic where forest fire season stretches implacably on. In November of 2020, researchers surveying people aged 26 to 45 found that 96% of them were very or extremely concerned about the well-being of their potential future children in a climate change world. One of the researchers said it was often heartbreaking to pour through the responses. A lot of people really poured their heart. So there's 3 ways you can react to that heartbreak. One is to pretend that it doesn't exist, which is easy to do if you watch Fox News, which in fact is the go-to network for older Americans. The median viewing age for a Fox News viewer, the median age is 68 years old, which means half of them are older than that. So according to Fox, you don't need to worry much about younger generations because they're just snowflakes who eat avocado toast while burning down American cities, whatever. Another option is to take care of your own family and volunteer in the community you live in, and perhaps take care of some other people, which is fine and good. But really, it's sort of what got us into this mess as we made, our suburbs and things ever nicer for the people who were in them. It's good as far as it goes, but as far as it goes isn't good enough. The wealth gap, the carbon gap keep growing. And the third is to actually rise to the political moment and play some role in turning the clock back or forward. And that's what we're trying to do with this third act thing, thirdact.org, which is progressive political organizing for people over 60. There's a lot of us, 70 million in this country, so bigger than the population of France. 10,000 more every day, which is more people than are born in this country every day. Not only are there a lot of us, our political weight is magnified by the fact that we all vote. It's impossible to keep old people away from the polls, no matter what. Not only that, so if you want to influence politics, it's good to do some work here. Not only that, we ended up with all the money, not particularly fairly perhaps, but people over the age of 60 had 70% of the country's financial assets, compared with about 5% for millennials. So if you want to pressure banks and financial institutions, you better get some older people engaged. Now, the conventional wisdom, and the reason that really no one ever tried to do this much, except for the Grey Panthers back in the 1970s and 80s, which some of you may recall, is that there's the conventional wisdom is that people get more conservative as they age. And there's some truth to that. I mean, look who voted for Donald Trump. People have more to protect. But we can't let it be true in this case, because we can't make change without some part of that block coming along. And I don't think it needs to be true, because the historical generational DNA of this particular group of people is interesting. If you're in your 60s or 70s or 80s now, your first act was pretty interesting. You were around for the most epic period of cultural, social, political transformation in history. I mean, that was the moment when we decided that women were going to be parts of society, on and on and on. So if taken as a whole, with plenty of noble exceptions who I'm sure are represented in this room, if our second act was a little more focused on consumerism than citizenship, that water's under the bridge. And now in our third act, it's necessary to recapture some of that first, the spirit of that first. We have resources, we have skills, we have time, which we didn't have before, perhaps, and we have kids or grandkids in many cases, which takes the question of legacy from an abstraction into something very real. It's about sort of effective love for the people coming after us. And so it's been great fun to be doing this organizing over the last little while. People responding to it with great fun, a great enthusiasm, and forming chapters hither and yon, and figuring out all kinds of fights to get engaged in, and doing it in conjunction, usually with lots and lots of young people. We have this big campaign about the big banks that provide the funding for the fossil fuel industry. And we're getting people to pledge that they'll cut up their credit cards at year's end. We're going to have a big day of cutting up credit cards and stuff. And we've been outside the banks a lot, and it's been really fun, often with young people. If we're marching, the young people are generally in the lead because they march a little faster. But at the back, there was, the last one I was at a week or two ago, we had a very large crowd of older people with a big banner that said "Fossils against fossil fuels." and so it's been great fun, and great fun to kind of summon as much of the spirit of that time as we can. Many of the cultural icons of that first act are still around and still helpful here. Young people, fight me if you will, but one thing about this generation is it produced the greatest music of all time. And so it is good fun to have, Bette Midler and Carole King and Patti Smith and Neil Young and on and on and on helping out. We're going to cause as much trouble as we can in the next while, because the next while is what counts. On both these questions of climate and of democracy, it feels, I know on the climate, the clock is ticking very fast. We've got a matter of years to make huge change. That's what the climate scientists tell us. And on the question of safeguarding our democracy, it figures like we're down to the last election or two, what might be the kind of last election or two, unless we manage to make some very powerful steps pretty fast. So if you've been keeping your powder dry for any reason, now is the moment. Join in. Let's do what we can. I realize that this has turned into more of a organizing talk than a book talk, whatever. Thank you very much for coming. It's really fun to be here.
Well, thank you so much. We're all about organizing and selling books here, so that's great. So I want to invite y'all to ask questions. We've got just a few minutes for questions. Open it up to the folks in the store first, and then we have some questions from the at-home audience. Yes.
So what happened to the solar panels?
We took them, they refused to take them at Obama's White House. We took them back to Maine, I think, and put them away for a while. But by the very end of Obama's second term, when he didn't have to run for office anymore, they did put solar panels, new ones, back up on the roof of the White House. We were happy to see. And I don't think, I'm sure it didn't even cross Trump. You would have had to go outdoors or something to see it. I don't think Trump even did anything with it.
They just stayed there by inertia.
I think
through
so.
the next, yeah.
I think that's right.
So we have a question from the at-home audience from Curry. Curry says, Jane Goodall is perhaps somewhat of an optimist respecting climate emergency, while Catherine Ingram, with her courage and acceptance, bends strongly in the two-weight direction. And Curry is asking for your position.
I spend as little time as possible trying to figure out whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic. I mean, I'm no Pollyanna. I wrote the first book about all this in 1989, and it had the cheerful title, The End of Nature. So, on the other hand, I spend all my time volunteering to, help build movements. So I wouldn't do it. I might have, I mean, truthfully, that's not my, it's not my personality. Like, I'm a writer. It's fun to be here with you all, sort of, but truth be told, left to my own devices, I'd rather be home typing. That's what I like to do. I'm a writer, but I do this because it's important. But I wouldn't do it just for fun. So, it feels to me like there's room left for, reason left for engagement and fighting. But mostly, instead of trying to, I just really do wake up in the morning and ask myself, what can I do today to make life hard for big oil companies? That seems, the most productive thing.
Thank you. Yes, I have a question back here.
Would it help to, is there any way to work of trying to increase the number of nuclear plants, for instance?
So nuclear plants, so first thing I'd say is probably a good idea if you have one up and running, to keep it running for now. To the degree that you can do it safely, it's paid for and it's producing low carbon power, so that's good. It's not going to be, I think, a big part of how most of the world deals with climate change, simply because it's an incredibly expensive way to generate power. In the last decade, the price of renewable energy, solar power, wind power, batteries to store them, have dropped about 90%. And that curve continues. Every time we double the installed capacity of solar power, we reduce the cost about another 30%, just because we get better at it. Nuclear power has been on a kind of opposite. It's gone up. It doesn't have a learning curve. It has the opposite. Not only that, they take extraordinarily long amount of time to build. Even if everything goes right, you're talking about something that happens over a decade. Whereas now we know how to build, say, offshore wind farms. They just built one in the North Sea that finished a couple of months ago. It's bigger output than a nuclear power plant, but start to finish, it took 18 months to get it up and running. So those are the technologies I think that are really going to matter. Now, there are people who say, and some of them I really like Jim Hansen, the great physicist, who thinks that we're not far away from some new generation of small modular reactors that'll be cheaper and safer and so on. And if that comes to pass, this may shift. I said, I wrote a piece in the New Yorker earlier this year saying, we've reached the point because of that steep fall in the price of renewable energy that we really could bring the kind of 200,000-year human career of setting stuff on fire to an end, and quite quickly, and rely instead on the fact that the good Lord hung a large ball of burning gas 93 million miles away in the sky, and we know how to use it. But one of the things I said in the piece, and I talked to some people who said, it's possible that we'll go put up solar panels and wind turbines now. And it doesn't come for free. I mean, you know, you have to take up some land and there's lithium to, you know, on and on and on. And in 2 generations, when we're gone, but, you know, we'll have gotten fusion power to the point where we can take those things down. Well, but for the moment, that's the job. Deploy the stuff on the shelf at a fast rate. That's what the Build Back Better bill, for instance, tries to help do. And that's precisely why Exxon et al. Have spent so much money making sure it didn't pass. You know? Because they know that it goes right at the heart of their business model.
So oh goodness, see now all the hands go up. 2 minutes before we're done. We do have one more question from the audience, and then I'm going to take one more question from the in-store audience. Then we have to get to the signing because we are in a tight time crunch.
And then I'll answer your question. I'll be over there. People got questions on it.
I was just going to say, as the signing is happening, we can probably fit in some more questions then. So thank you all for your understanding on that. So at home, Patricia says, and this is an interesting question, which do you think will have a greater effect on where people will move to? I'm assuming she's meaning people, you know, human migration, political reasons and policies, or climate change disasters.
I have a feeling that in a certain way, they're synergistic here. People always are asking me, where should I move? And the only, I mean, if you were forced to give a kind of geographic answer, New Zealand is the right answer, but not that many people. New Zealand's figured this out too, and what do you know, they're not that eager to help everybody arrive in their midst. The real answer to that question is safety is going to lie in moving to places with strong communities, because after 50 years of, I mean, we've had 50 years where neighbors have been an entirely optional thing in our lives. Didn't really need them for anything. They might be nice to know, but most Americans actually don't even know their neighbors. 3/4 of Americans don't know their next door neighbor. That's not going to be true of the next 50 years. You need people around when there's a flood or a fire or whatever it is. So, but the reason those answers seem synergistic to me is that those are also the kind of places I'd want to move to get out of the kind of political hell that we're quickly creating too, you know. So Asheville is probably one of those kind of places. I think of it as this sort of,
Don't say that out loud on the internet.
I think of it as, you know, I live in Vermont, and this place feels like the Vermont of the, you know, Southern Mountains. And, you know, it's no accident that people are going to be moving to these places in some numbers. The degree of, the thing to look for, the indicator to look for is not about temperature and humidity, it's about the level of social trust in a place. Vermont came through the pandemic better than any other place in the country, precisely because it scores off the charts compared to the rest of the country on those levels of social trust. So what did everybody do? Everybody wore a mask without even, you know, there was one demonstration at the state capitol with anti-mask. They drew like 15 reporters and 6 protesters, and then they interviewed the protesters. Most of them like, yeah, you know what? I just don't want being told what to do, but really it's a pretty good idea to want to. You know, so I mean, that's what that's to me what would drive rational migration. Of course, there's going to be tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people on the planet who will have no choice. They'll just have to flee from wherever they are and try to find someplace where there's food, and that's already underway. And it's not their fault in any way. The iron law of global warming is the less you do to cause it, the sooner and the harder you get hit. Just remember when you see those pictures of people in droughts in Africa, like Somalia right now, the entire continent of Africa has produced 2% of all the greenhouse gases in the air. The 4% of humans who live in the US have produced 25% of the world's greenhouse gases. So doing the moral math is not actually all that difficult.
Thank you so much.
One more here.
Yeah, so one more, very quickly.
I'm sorry.
I'm really interested in your thoughts about the carbon tax. Is that one of the huge changes that you think we
So carbon tax has always been a good idea,
Okay.
but you can't get it without breaking the political power of the fossil fuel industry. There was a great hidden camera video of Exxon's chief lobbyist that came out last August. He thought he was talking to someone else, so he was very open. He said at one point, "We've said we're for a carbon tax for years because we know it'll never pass. And it's the thing that gets us off the hook. You know, we just pretend to be for it," he says. So that's why we build movements that do things like divestment, that go after the banks to cut off their money, so on and so forth. If we break their political power, there's never been any mystery about all the policy steps we should be taking. We've known about them since the 1980s. The mystery's always been about how we're going to break their political power sufficient to let it happen. Just bear in mind that the reason we're not passing the Build Back Better bill is because there are 50 Republican senators who are, in this case, a wholly owned subsidiary of the fossil fuel industry, and because Joe Manchin has taken more money from the fossil fuel industry than anybody else in Washington. Not an easy contest to win. He won it, and the return on investment from the oil industry for their campaign donations is almost, they gave them a couple $1 million, and in return, they're holding up $500 billion in, groundbreaking money that would really change where we stand. So that's the job. That's why I say I get up in the morning trying to figure out how to cause them trouble. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.